And thank you for participating in today's Justice Clearinghouse webinar, which has been sponsored by Ultra Electronics Forensic Technology. This 60-minute webinar will focus on making gun crime a priority in your region, especially as it relates to development of those crime-fighting programs. But first, a bit about our sponsor. Ultra Electronics Forensic Technology is a leader in forensic analysis, providing innovative and effective solutions like its unique technology, the Integrated Ballistics Identification System, or IBIS. IBIS is designed to find the needle in the haystack by discovering matches between pairs of spent bullets and cartridge cases at speeds that are well beyond human capacity. Forensic technology helps experts obtain timely information so they can make society a safer place. For our presentation today, we have three great speakers. Our opening presenter is Dr. Bill King, who is a professor and associate dean for research and program development in the College of Criminal Justice at Sam Houston State University. His research includes the quantitative and comparative study of police organizational structure, the process of criminal investigations, and the study of forensic systems from an organizational perspective. Our second presenter is Mr. Ron Nichols, who has 25 plus years of experience as a firearms and tool mark examiner at the local and federal levels in accredited laboratories. He is widely published, with a number of his publications routinely referenced in published court decisions with respect to Daubert and Frye evidentiary hearings. He has testified in over 100 criminal cases and evidentiary hearings involving firearm and tool mark evidence at the state and federal levels. And then our final presenter is Mr. Jim Needles, who is currently a forensic intelligence strategy manager for Ultra Electronics Forensic Technology. After 28 years of service, Jim recently retired from the ATF. He began his ATF career as a street agent in Chicago and was then assigned to the Office of Inspections before assignment to the New York, Phoenix, and Chicago Field Division. Jim was also chief of the Firearms Operations Division, having national oversight over the NIBIN branch and firearms trafficking branch, among others. Now, before we begin, I'd like to share a few housekeeping details about the webinar. First, Ultra has provided the presentation materials, which can be downloaded directly from the GoToWebinar toolbar under Handouts. Second, this is a listen-only event. However, you can enter any questions you have through the GoToWebinar toolbar, and we'll address them after the presentation. And finally, we have included a post-webinar survey, and we ask that you complete it. This survey helps us continually improve our programming. And with that, Bill, it's all yours.
Hey, thank you, Aaron. Good morning and good afternoon. Slide. Hey, here we go. So I'm going to talk about ballistics imaging systems and the information they produce to maximize your impact on violent gun crime. My part of the talk is going to focus on the ways we can combat violent gun crime, and so I'm not going to focus on illegal possession of firearms. The growing research literature on the best ways to prevent crime generally indicates that we need to focus our efforts on certain places, certain times, certain people, and certain behaviors. In other words, you know this, we want to concentrate our resources on hot spots, hot times, hot people, and hot illegal activities. Ballistics imaging systems like IBIS and NIBIN and the information they produce are very powerful tools for identifying repeat use firearms, and hopefully we're able to identify high-rate violent offenders. So that's what my talk is going to focus on. The effectiveness of these ballistic imaging systems for identifying high-rate violent offenders is based on a three-pronged approach, what Pete Gagliardi calls a three-legged stool: the technology, the hardware and the software of IBIS or NIBIN, the people, and in this way we want to think broadly about all the people who deal with gun crime in your area, from victims in the scene to prosecution and corrections on the other end, and we want to think about the processes that link all the people and the information together. Slide. I want to start with two studies of case failures where a ballistics imaging system was very ineffective in halting violent crime. And I think it's important to start with failure because in both places they had IBIS or NIBIN and the technology worked really well. So they had one-legged stool. The failure came because the other two legs, the people and the processes, were inadequate. So case study number one is a country in the Caribbean. They experienced a considerable homicide epidemic where homicide rates increased more than 400% over 10 years. The increase in homicide was driven by firearms, which consequently clogged the crime lab with firearms evidence. And then as the backlog at the lab grew, lab processing times increased greatly. Consequently, the police responded by not sending firearms evidence to the lab because it just didn't matter. This is disturbing, but probably not uncommon. The backlog and the delays meant that investigators had to wait on average 850 days from the crime scene until they received a hit report. Worse yet, as I traveled around the country tracking down where hit reports went, I discovered that a third of homicide detectives never received a hit report. The hit reports went to the wrong person in the police agency. A third of the hit reports went to the proper investigator, and in a third of homicides, I couldn't tell who got the hit report. Consequently, homicide clearance rates in this country dropped to less than 10%. That's bad. Slide. Case study number 2 comes from a police agency in the U.S. It's a police agency that has a NIBIN terminal, but they could not confirm their hits because they had a firearms technician and not a firearms examiner. There's a difference. The police department had to submit their possible hits. These are high confidence candidates that have been identified as likely hits to their state crime lab. But that state crime lab throttled the agency and would only confirm a small number of hits per month. Consequently, this agency, the investigators had to wait on average over 2,000 days between a crime and a hit report. And if you're an investigator, you work in law enforcement, you can imagine how frustrating it is to wait more than 6 years to get a ballistics imaging hit report. Slide. So what can we learn from these 2 case studies of failure? Communication between a lab and the police agency is crucial. In the first case in the Caribbean, the lab didn't know that the police weren't submitting all their evidence, and the lab didn't know that the hit reports weren't getting to the proper investigators. The police, because they generally didn't talk to the lab, didn't know they were giving the incorrect names of investigators to the lab in the first place. In the U.S., well, you have a problem with people, and that police agency solved their delay by hiring a contract firearms examiner who was able to quickly confirm hits. Their number of hits increased 5-fold, and their average time dropped from more than 2,000 days to less than 30 days. That's great. Slide. I just want to kind of hammer home this point of processing delays and how they differ and how they're bad for investigations. They differ across the United States, and what we're looking at here is, well, here we go. Some sites are quick and some are slow. And ideally, you want to know how quickly your ballistics imaging system is producing hits for investigator. This slide shows the average, that's the median days between a crime and when a ballistics imaging hit report was produced. The letters on the bottom represent different police agencies. So B is one police agency lab, and they're relatively slow compared to their peers. And on the right-hand side, you see the S. That's another police department lab in the U.S. And they're very quick. You should be measuring processing time, and you should have a feel for how useful these hits are and how quickly you're doing them. Slide. So how can we improve the performance of your ballistics imaging system, or if you're going to get one, what sort of things should you put in place to make sure it's going to perform optimally? My first advice is to think about the journey of physical evidence and information from the scene to the lab, and then from the lab onto investigators and prosecution and corrections. Slide. So this picture slide here is just showing you a diagram of the flow of evidence from left to right. At each step, we have an opportunity to lose information or evidence. That's bad. There's an opportunity to hold it back or delay it from the next step. That's bad. What we want to, as quickly and accurately as possible, push evidence and information from left to right. So it's useful to think about each step in the process and streamline the little snafus that can slow the process, or worse, it could cause evidence to drop out. Slide. To be a little more specific, I'm going to read from the bottom of the slide a little bit. You might find it useful to borrow from the problem-oriented policing literature and use the SARA model, scan, analyze, respond, and assess. But instead of looking for hotspots or problems in your community, you're going to scan for possible problems and delays in how you're processing your evidence and how you're flowing information from scenes to end users. So you want to scan very carefully for these problems and where are the roadblocks and where's information dropping out. You want to then study the problems and figure out what causes them. You want to make solutions and respond. And then you have to come back and make sure that you haven't created new problems or caused some sort of snafu in your system. I think Pete Gagliardi's book, 13 Critical Tasks, is a really useful guide for making an optimally performing ballistics imaging system. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ron Nichols.
Next slide, Jim. I worked for 25 plus years doing firearms casework in forensic laboratories, and I was with the Oakland Police Department when NIBIN was first introduced to crime labs. And when it was introduced, ballistic imaging technology was used on the back end of casework. And what it did was provide a digital solution to an open case file that had been previously a Polaroid file if one was kept at all. So when I had cases that I would work, I would actually take a Polaroid photograph of the cartridge cases. I saw it underneath a microscope, and I would put that into a file. And then when I would get other cases in, I would go through that photo file to see if there were any that looked similar to it. And the thing is, only cases that were actually worked by the laboratory went into the system. And due to continuous backlogs for most laboratories, it was likely weeks after a shooting event, if not months, if they put it in at all. Next. So when we look at this diagram, I'm just going to give you a sense of what it used to be like. And the title of the slide is Historically Speaking. But in many ways, this is still the way NIBIN is used in many forensic laboratories. So on the left-hand side, we can see that for homicide 1, there was no suspect. Once the case was worked, it was put into ballistic imaging, and the results came back negative. And then 2 weeks later, there was a drive-by with no victims. And if a case is submitted to the laboratory at all, it will receive a low priority. There's no victims, there's no blood, and chances are it certainly won't be put in an NIBIN, and we don't know the time frame that it would get in, if at all. Now, 4 weeks later, there's a drive-by where a child is killed, and there's witnesses for that one, and they identify the suspect because a child was killed. And so they're pretty furious about that, and that gets over their fear, so they go ahead and name a suspect. They put that into ballistic imaging or NIBIN, and then it's linked to homicide 1. Now the thing is, in many laboratories we'd actually celebrate that because we were able to close off 2 homicides with one individual. However, what if that drive-by was committed by the same shooter and the same gun? If that was put in a timely basis, is it possible that the child that was killed in the other drive-by would have never been killed because the shooter would have been taken off the streets? Now, for certain, we don't know if there would be any witnesses for that middle drive-by shooting, but there could have been. And what we found is that if we're not putting in all the evidence, what we're going to do is be restricting the intelligence that we can get from the evidence that's actually on the streets. So what we're trying to do is take that evidence and turn it into, if you will, a sort of witness for that crime in identifying at least patterns for guns if the same gun is used from scene to scene to scene. Next. So what we've been proposing, what I was proposing when I was with ATF, is a concept called forensic-led policing. And a typical firearms case, when it comes into the laboratory, the evidence is processed by the laboratory and it's given to a firearm examiner. And because of accreditation issues and everything else, the process for actually working a case can be rather lengthy due to the documentation and everything else that's needed. And if we want to see comprehensive collection of evidence and comprehensive entry of evidence, it's important to be able to get as much evidence in as possible in as short a time frame as possible. So what ends up happening is in a forensic-led policing effort, the automated ballistic processing is put on the front end of casework instead of the back end. Because the bottom line is not every case will result in a NIBIN lead. Not every case will a lead develop. And it is ridiculous to put in all the effort of a firearm examiner when in many instances that case will never go further than the automated ballistic processing. So what is recommended is that the automated ballistic processing go in first with an evidence inventory and assessment, acquisition, correlation review, and then notification within 24 to 72 hours of the incident. Because the report that Dr. King worked on demonstrated that after 1 week, the investigative value of this information drops off precipitously. So the effort is to get that investigative information there as quickly as possible. As you can see, if a lead is developed, then there's an investigative follow-up. And that's when the information can be given back to the crime laboratory to actually do further work on that case if need be. In most instances, though, a lead will not be developed. We won't know that until it actually gets into the system. So we can just close and release it at that point. Now, I don't recommend that homicides and assaults with identified victims be handled in this way, but there is also a streamlined approach for them. Now, as an example of this forensic-led policing effort, we've been able to, when I was with ATF, we were able to set up 2 cities in particular. And right now, one particular city is getting leads out in 24 hours. That's from incident to feedback to patrol. They're getting the leads out in 24 hours. In another city with a population of about 650,000, they are actually getting in all firearm-related evidence, 75% of that evidence, within 3 days, and they're getting lead information back. 95% of the evidence is getting into the system, and they're getting reports back within a single week. And what we found is that they had 3,000 entries over the course of the year, 290 leads, and out of those 290 leads, 115 different shooters were either identified or arrested as a result of those leads. So it can be very effective. And what we've been finding is that even forensic laboratories have been using this model, have been finding a lot more success. And one of the primary complaints has been, well, then it's just going to increase our caseload because they're going to keep requesting that all these things be confirmed. Well, that's not actually true, because most of the forensic laboratories who issue these leads find out that the follow-up is not as much as they expected. So it's been very efficient and very effective when it's been put into place. Next. One of the things that laboratories have cited is that, well, we can't do it because of accreditation. Well, forensic laboratories in the United States function either under ISO IEC 17020 or ISO IEC 17025. Those are the 2 possible accrediting guidelines by which forensic laboratories would function. If you look at the minimum requirements for those accrediting bodies, those ISO standards, they do not prohibit a streamlined approach to the handling of firearm-related evidence. What they do is they require a laboratory to follow the procedures they have set in place. But what they can do is modify those procedures, and they will still be within the guidelines. And once they modify the procedures, then they can have a more streamlined approach. Now, I'm not recommending that, again, homicides and assaults should be handled that way. They should be handled in a normal manner. But the entry, the NIBIN entry for those can be more integrated with the actual case, so that the NIBIN entry is not waiting on a completion of the case, but only on just enough information for the firearm examiner to hand off the necessary cartridge cases to a NIBIN tech. And finally, with respect to this, it's important to say don't prioritize the backlog because it's already too late. There is, it's important to remain timely and choose a date and decide from this day forward we're going to do operations in a different way. Because if we focus on the backlog, we will never catch up. So it's important to ensure that the processes that are set in place can function and function well. And then as they're functioning and as a laboratory is remaining current, then they can go into the backlog from the most current date forward. Next. So what's the key? The key is actually collaboration and not cooperation. And there's a significant difference, because when we're looking at collaboration, we are taking ownership of our role in responding to a problem. When we cooperate, we tend to do what we need to do what we need to do to simply get through the problem. So we're not responding to the problem. We're not taking ownership of our role in the problem. We're just saying yes, and we'll do what we got to do, but nothing more. In collaboration, we become a source of a team-based solution. When we're cooperating, we become part of someone else's solution. And as a result, in cooperation, we tend to resent our role and look for failings in others to absolve ourselves of responsibility. So if we're simply cooperating, we tend to blame it on the detectives. Well, they're not getting us the evidence. They're not doing this right. They're not doing that right. Whereas in collaboration, we understand that our role is vital, and we take responsibility for ourselves without concern for what others are doing. I'll give an example. I was in a meeting yesterday in which a laboratory basically said, hey, we're reaching out, and we're not getting good response back from our partner agencies. But we're doing everything we can on our end so that when they do respond, we can assist them in the best way that we can. And that is what collaboration is all about. It's about taking responsibility for ourselves and not worrying about what anybody else is doing. Just knowing that when we are called upon to do the work, that we will be able to do it. And what collaboration does is it responds to a crime problem, hopefully reducing it in the future. Whereas when we're simply cooperating, we're reacting to crimes that have already occurred with absolutely no vision for the future. An example of that is when we look at that, if we recall that slide where I talk about the homicide in the 2 drive-bys, and in emphasis on backlogs, we talk about desiring to give closure to families. And I'm all for that. What I'm also for is reducing the number of families in our communities that actually need closure due to gun crime. There is a way that NIBIN can be used to effectively reduce the amount of gun crime that's happening on the streets by getting active shooters off the streets. There are too many kids dying in incidental gunfire. We look at Columbine, and we look at the school shooting in Connecticut. But we have to understand that there are a number of kids dying on a daily basis that are equal to those. And it's happening because we are not responding to this crime problem that we have. Rather, we are just reacting to it. Next. So what is forensic-led policing? It's important to assess the strategic resource allocation that the agencies have and various crime gun intelligence strategies related to forensic-led policing efforts for firearm-related violence. It's not just a lab issue. It's not just a detective issue. We have crime scene processing. Is there a way to, as Bill was talking about that evidence, there are gun crimes that occur where the police don't even know. Are there ways to mitigate them? As an example, there are various technologies such as ShotSpotter that have demonstrated that police only get calls on like 30% of the shootings that actually occur in a community. So do we have these different technologies available, and can we bring them in that chart that Bill had up? Can we bring them in to maximize the evidence that we're getting and to maximize the evidence input into the system so that we're getting the maximum amount of intelligence out of the system? The second part of that will be to customize procedures, processes, and policies, allowing agencies to more effectively and efficiently process and examine firearm-related evidence, providing valuable crime gun intelligence to investigators within 24 to 72 hours. It can happen, and it can happen while meeting all those minimum accreditation requirements. What has to occur is that there is a desire on the part of the forensic laboratory to actually do that. And finally, the third leg of that is to customize training to law enforcement and laboratory personnel in the procedures and processes. For a lot of years, NIBIN was the domain of a firearm examiner. What NIBIN is, though, it's an investigative tool. It shouldn't be a lab-based tool. It can be in a lab, but it's still an investigative tool. And it does not require the expertise of a firearm examiner to run. NIBIN can be run using personnel who are well-trained and have expertise in NIBIN, but don't need the level of training that a firearm examiner has, so that we can increase the input and increase the output from NIBIN to provide that strategic intelligence to police officers and detectives on the streets. And with that, I'm going to hand this over to Jim.
Thank you, Ron. And good afternoon, everybody. Talking about policy and leading the way with policy and continuing and building upon what Bill and Ron have discussed here. If you're going to make gun crime a priority, if you're going to make gun crime a priority and enforce the laws on the books, you need to put policies in place. And a good place to start is by reviewing the 2012 IACP Resolution titled Regional Crime Gun Processing Protocols. At a minimum, incorporate these protocols into your policy. This will give your department, a solid foundation in investigating firearm violence. As you can see, these are very clear, straightforward policies. Check the gun in NCIC, trace all the recovered crime guns, process crime gun test fires and ballistic evidence through NIBIN. Very clear and to the point. In this next slide, we see a best practice from the state of New Jersey. State legislation passed laws requiring state law enforcement agencies to query all recovered crime guns in NCIC and trace all crime guns through ATF's E-Trace system, process all crime guns in the NIBIN system. Delaware has also passed similar legislation. So how does policy get implemented? It starts with stakeholder buy-in. The first component of a preventive firearm strategy. A stakeholder is an individual who has the power to drive change at the required levels and provide or advocate for resource support for the people, processes, and technology, as Bill King alluded to, the people, processes, and technology needed to support or develop a preventive firearm strategy. So it's decision makers. Stakeholders from law enforcement, prosecutors' offices, and forensics must collaborate and work as a team to make sure they meet the needs of all the stakeholders, including the public. As Ron stated, it's collaboration. It can't be just law enforcement setting their policies, the prosecutor's office setting their policies, forensics setting their policies. It must be done together, collaborative. Each of these entities must collaborate and work as a team. So each understands the needs of the other, and policies can be put in place so all the stakeholders' needs are met. When the stakeholders are developing clear policies, they must keep in mind these policies must create a network that will give investigators actionable crime gun intelligence within 48 hours of an offense. When developing your policies, you want to incorporate a regional approach, second component of a preventive crime gun strategy.
Hey, Jim, I'm not able to hear you right now. I'm assuming the audience is not able to either. I don't know if you went on mute or something else happened. Okay, everyone. I think probably Jim is having some technical issues with the presentation. Give us 1 or 2 minutes and we'll work on resolving this. 1 second, please. All right, everyone. I think we've got Jim back now. And Jim, go ahead and continue, please.
Aaron, can you tell me about the spot where got cut out?
You bet. So you were talking about implementing a regional approach.
Okay. When developing our policies, you want to incorporate a regional approach, which is the second component of a preventive crime gun strategy. Bad guys don't know jurisdictional boundaries. They move across state, even international borders, and with them moves evidence getting left behind along the way. We must bridge these cross-jurisdictional gaps. By entering your agency's ballistic evidence into NIBIN and correlating with evidence entered from other agencies in your region, you're maximizing an investigator's ability to link and solve gun crime. The third component of a preventive crime gun strategy is making NIBIN the cornerstone of that strategy. NIBIN's a pointer system, generates leads. It answers the question, what crimes has the gun in question been used to commit? When developing your policies concerning your department's NIBIN program, make sure you include comprehensive collection of cartridge cases from crime scenes and test fires from crime guns, not just evidence from, say, blood shootings. Enter evidence from all crime gun incidences because you don't know what is important. What we may call celebratory shooting, that could very well lead to investigators to being able to solve crimes they have no leads for. Entries and analysis must be timely. Remember, we want investigative leads generated within 48 hours. Investigative follow-up needs to be addressed in your policies. Don't assume investigative follow-up will automatically occur. Your investigators need to be educated in how to best utilize NIBIN to enhance their investigations. You also have to set up a mechanism for feedback. Feedback gives you the ability to monitor success in your program. When you're developing the policies for your NIBIN program, be sure to address comprehensive collection, timeliness, investigative follow-up, and feedback. So let's talk about NIBIN and utilizing NIBIN. Why is NIBIN important? Well, NIBIN links crimes that would not otherwise have been linked. It links crimes more quickly, has the ability to share intelligence across jurisdictional boundaries, gives detectives timely information to advance their investigations, and it gives prosecutors admissible evidence to corroborate witness testimony. When developing a preventive crime gun strategy, you must understand what technologies are available to your agency and affected region. There's no one technology in and of itself that's going to give you your desired impact in firearm violence. But when you overlay technologies, you can get the desired impact. When you use ShotSpotter, NIBIN, GunOps, which is an analytical software, E-Trace, cell phone analysis, social media software, human information, then you can get the impact you're looking for. When you have to develop, but you have to develop through clear policy, is how you will use these technologies, and most importantly, what resources will you need to support these technologies. You can't just say, I want the technologies, want to have that piece of equipment in my office, in my lab. What resources is going to take to support these technologies so you can use them to their full potential? The next component is knowing your offenders and how they interact. Where do your offenders get their guns? For many offenders, it's through their social network. Are they on probation or parole? Do they have previous firearm offenses, gang affiliation? Know who's in the community, who are the good and the bad guys. Understand the difference in how to interact with them. And that's really the challenge. It's more than answering a 911 call. Make the public partners in solving crime. The final component of the preventive crime gun strategy is the utilization of one intel unit. Ideally, develop a crime gun intelligence center for your region. This will be a formal partnership with an MOU for sharing of information among participating agencies. The goal would be to produce timely, actionable gun intelligence, which can then lead to targeted enforcement. The development of a gun center is not feasible. At minimum, develop points of contact with the agencies in your region and share information at weekly meetings. This is something we all can do. Communicate and share information. We talk about it a lot, but rarely do these meetings get set up and sustained where they continue on. We meet for 2-3 times and then they kind of fade off and we don't do it again. We have to have these weekly meetings to share and communicate our information. What we want to do is we want to get the shooters off the street before they can reoffend. We want to break that cycle of violence. We must ensure that investigatory processes are thorough, consistently applied, and well managed. Don't be intimidated or feel overwhelmed when you're developing or enhancing your programs. Setting up these programs, enhancing them, this doesn't happen overnight. Bottom line is you want to advance the professionalism of your officers and improve the delivery of police services in your area. And, we can help you do that by developing policies and protocols. That's the key. Other questions, Aaron?
Great, Jim. Thank you very much. And thank you also to Bill and Ron for the presentations. We have received several questions. And the first one that I would like to present to, I'm not exactly sure who would be the correct responder for this, is when an agency wants to set up this kind of program, how can they find a tool examiner to be able to bring on a contractual basis to help them implement these programs?
This is Ron, and what you can do is there's an AFTI website. It's www.afte.org, and they have employment opportunities on there. You can contact a webmaster and indicate that you are looking for a contract firearm examiner. You can also reach out to me, not to be the contract firearm examiner necessarily, but if you give me an idea of where you're located, I know of some retirees in the area who might be able to assist you with that.
Thank you so much. And I would encourage everyone, we've received a number of questions, but please feel free to submit additional questions. Next question is, within the community, who would you say is responsible for helping to build out these programs? Is this the job of law enforcement? Is it the job of elected officials, the prosecutor? Who should be involved and who should be held responsible for implementing these kind of programs?
This is Jim. My view on that is what we've been brought up during this webinar is a collaborative effort of all involved, of the stakeholders. Stakeholders being law enforcement, prosecutors, labs, certainly city councils, mayors, those decision makers who have the ability to enact. In the case of state of New Jersey, it was they enacted legislation to help with their strategies, but it's the decision makers, and it's all of them in a collaborative effort working together.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, and regarding DNA, many prosecutors routinely ask for this to be done, but not only is there limited funding for DNA, but DNA does not tell you when, how, or for how long. In cases where the suspect has provided a reliable confession, what is the position on holding off on DNA testing?
This is Ron. There are some agents, it depends what the DNA processing is for. If we're looking at swabbing recovered firearms, then there are a lot, not a lot, but several agencies who have employed routine DNA swabbing and just storing the swabs until later if it's deemed necessary. As an example, Cincinnati and New Jersey both have implemented routine DNA swabbing of the firearms and have continued to process their firearms within 24 hours. With respect to DNA on fired cartridge cases, that's an entirely different issue. I have not seen reliable reports where they've been able to get typable and usable DNA off of cartridge cases. I saw some reports out of San Diego that demonstrated that there was a potential process, but as that issue has been discussed further, they've been backing off on those claims a little bit. It was the work of a graduate student. So I'm not exactly sure where that is in a greater scheme of things. I do know that in Denver, the crime lab director there, who is a large proponent of using technology, had said that the value from more timely and comprehensive collection of NIBIN, of cartridge cases for NIBIN, is more valuable than the opportunity or the chance that he would actually get DNA off a cartridge case. So basically, he shared with the prosecutor's office that DNA typing would not be routinely performed on those cases. And that's why collaboration is important. Because if there's a prosecutor's office or the AUSA is demanding a certain type of thing simply to cover all bases, that's not necessarily the best approach when we're trying to get those active shooters off the streets.
Great. Thank you so much. Next question is, do you think a statewide law mandating use of an integrated system for investigating gun crime is a prerequisite or requirement for being able to implement an effective program?
This is Jim. It really goes on a case-by-case basis, and although New Jersey implemented that, they felt that was the best approach for them. Delaware also felt it was a best approach for them. You know, in those two states, policy leads the way for them. It does give, you know, certainly clear perspective, clear message to law enforcement and what they need to do when a firearm's recovered. So, like I said, though, it's kind of a case-by-case basis, but certainly it doesn't hurt. I don't know that it needs to be a prerequisite, but it's certainly for New Jersey, it's working out well.
Great. Thank you very much.
Hey,
and
Aaron.
with that, yes, please.
Oh, yeah, I just want to jump in on that. A good answer, Jim. This is Bill King. I don't think a state law is required. One of the issues is just with the ballistics imaging. It works well in urban areas or it works well in areas where you have a lot of violent gun crime use and it's repeat gun use. And unless you have a problem in a rural area, it's not going to be fully effective. And so if you make a state law that drives little police departments and your rural county sheriffs to transport that stuff to a NIBIN site and clog that NIBIN site by putting it in, and it's not repeat gun use, you're not only are you not doing any good, you're creating problems. And so you want to be careful with state laws is my only caution.
Got it. That's really good perspective, and very much appreciate that. Well, with that, Bill, I just wanted to give you and Ron provide you and Jim provide you the opportunity to make any kind of closing statements or things that you know, what you think is the most critical thing that people can get out of this webinar.
Oh, okay, thanks, Aaron.
Do you want to go first?
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. Really enjoyed putting this together and working with Ron and Jim in Justice Clearinghouse on this presentation. It's the rehash like I do with my students. It's the three-legged stool. It isn't just the technology and the hardware and the software, which is proven and it works really well. You need the right people in place and you need the processes. And that's where the devil lies in the details, because that's either where excellence occurs or that's where things start to get sloppy and fall apart. And it's tough work to kind of think about the little things that can go wrong and the little things that can go right, but it's crucial. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And actually, before I have the next, before Ron speaks, we just ended up getting a couple of, I thought, really good questions that I did want to ask you all about. What is your advice regarding testing of shotguns, revolvers, and long guns? And I wonder if you could expand on that, or if you have enough information from the question to be able to answer.
This is Ron. I do have enough information. What you should be doing is looking at the cartridge cases that are being routinely recovered in shootings that are occurring. As an example, I worked with one city who wanted to test fire their entire backlog of guns. We're talking thousands of guns. And what I did is I looked in the NIBIN database and discovered that 95% of their shootings were actually occurring with only 4 different calibers. It will take forever to test fire thousands of guns. And for the most part, it's pretty useless to do that when 95% of the shooting crime is being committed with 4 calibers. So the best way to do is evaluate what's going on in your local region. As an example, NIBIN routinely would not consider revolver cartridge cases. However, in New Orleans, they found it valuable because the shooters would actually empty the revolver at the scene and proceed to shoot their dead victim even more. And so they would recover revolver cartridge cases at crime scenes rather routinely. So take a look at the shootings, take a look at the type of evidence that's being recovered, and focus on those calibers.
Great, thank you very much. The next question that we got in just a few minutes ago is, how do you define a crime gun? For example, would a gun that is recovered during a police investigation that has not necessarily been used in a crime be considered a crime gun?
This is Jim. Could you repeat that last part of that question?
You bet. So they were basically getting at, if a firearm has been recovered at the scene of a crime, but there's no evidence to indicate that it was used in the crime, would that be considered a crime gun?
If the firearm was found at the scene of a crime, I would consider it a crime gun, yes. And you know, and if you're talking about entering that firearm, a test fire from that firearm into NIBIN, you know, there's a NIBIN MOU that clearly delineates, you know, what goes in and what goes and what doesn't, which would be crime guns recovered at crime scenes.
Great, thank you. And the last question for today, and then Ron, Jim, I'll let you guys kind of do your closing comments, is, are there any other technologies such as ShotSpotter that you recommend be integrated with an IBIN program to try to help facilitate the collection of shell casings and so on?
Well, I definitely would recommend ShotSpotter. That is a great complement to the NIBIN program. That, you know, that has that leads you. ShotSpotter is going to lead you to where the shell casings are, where a shooting occurred. And you know, if you have ShotSpotter, if you have that technology, why wouldn't you use NIBIN? That would be the next step. It leads you to the shell casing, to the cartridge cases. You get those cartridge cases collected into evidence and entered into NIBIN for processing.
Great, thank you. Okay, well, I think that does it for the questions. I'm sorry that we got a little bit out of order with those things. I appreciate your patience with that. Closing comments, Ron.
I just want to stress that crime gun intelligence and an effective crime gun strategy is really a collaborative effort. You know, I think of the upcoming NFL draft, where really you're focusing on certain individuals to complement the team, and, you know, identifying who those individuals are and then to bring those individuals in. It's important to understand that within various agencies, there are individuals who have strengths and weaknesses, and there are certain agencies that have that as well. And it's really important to get creative minds on board who can think about enlarging their organizational box. I don't think we'll ever be able to get out of our box thinking, but we can at least enlarge our box. As an example, in one city, the NIBIN effort that I was speaking about earlier, where now they're getting results back within 24 hours of an incident, the entire thing was begun by a property clerk who saw the potential and wanted to take advantage of it. So it can start anywhere. But what it does do is require a significant amount of collaboration and pulling in elements from crime scene recovery to the lab to the prosecutor's office to detectives to work collaboratively together to decide how we're going to respond to this problem. And I think when they do that and when they can enlarge their individual boxes, then what we're going to find is a true effort, and they're going to find a lot of success in being able to do that.
Great, thank you so much. Jim, closing comments.
Well, I was going to, I would echo what Ron said with collaborative work, that the stakeholders from law enforcement, prosecutors, forensics, they must collaborate, work as a team, put these strategies together. And then, once they do that, they have to ensure that the investigatory processes are thorough, consistently applied, and well managed.
Great. Thank you so much. Well, again, I want to thank Bill, Ron, and Jim for their time today for this presentation. We will be doing a follow-up additional webinar on crime gun intelligence programs on June 8th. You can find that on the Justice Clearinghouse website and register for it now. And with that, this concludes today's Justice Clearinghouse webinar. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.